Welcome to Curtain Call, the show where we go behind the curtain with the stars of the culture wars. I'm your host, Alexandra Marshall, and this week we're joined by Lyle Shelton. Lyle, it's wonderful to have you here on Curtain Call today.
It's a great privilege, Ellie. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know you, of course, as the star or one of the stars of The Good Source, where you do a range of political commentary on social and political issues. But I consulted Wikipedia and found out that you've actually done other things. So you were a rural journalist. You were a lobbyist for 10 years with the Australian Christian Lobby. You're a social campaigner during the same-sex marriage, in which you argued for the No campaign. You're Federal Communications Director for the Australian Conservatives and author of, and this is one of my favourites, I Kid You Not, Notes from 20 Years in the Trenches of the Culture Wars. And of course, the recently announced successor to Fred Niles, which will leave you leading the Christian Democratic Party. So my obvious question is, how on earth did you come to live your life in the thick of the culture wars?
I must be a sucker for punishment, Ellie. I'm actually quite surprised that Wikipedia seems to be reasonably accurate. You're obviously just reading the nice things on Wikipedia about me. I hate to think what else is there. But look, I've been passionate about I guess the culture war issue since I was a teenager, to be honest. And I guess studying journalism at university, whilst I was in rural journalism, I was covering rural industry politics. So always had a fascination with politics. And one thing just kept leading to another.
Well, to be fair, on Wikipedia, they consider your talking points to be a negative. So while they're accurately documenting your career, they think they're doing a bad job, but it's actually pretty good, pretty straightforward. Throughout your videos and your articles, which I had a little read of earlier, you make it clear that Australia is embroiled in the culture wars. But I have noticed that conservative politics and a range of our conservative parties are apprehensive to engage in these culture wars. And so I'm wondering, is this because they lack the ability to discuss the culture wars? That they maybe don't believe that they're important, or worst of all, that perhaps our conservative parties actually agree with the rise of Marxism in Australia?
Wow. It's probably a combination of all three, I think, Ellie. I think the biggest problem is a lot of Australians, a lot of conservative-leaning people are in denial. Life has been generally pretty good in this country, and it is good. We're reasonably prosperous. Most people are just getting on with their lives and don't want to know about cancel culture or wokeism or this sort of thing. They see it perhaps as a bit of an irritant off to the side, but the reality is it's reaching out and touching all of our lives. And I guess one of my passions is to try and wake people up to the fact that there is a war going on, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which is very important to people like myself who are people of faith, is under pressure like never before. And I think we've got to sound the alarm. We've got to engage in the battle for ideas. And I think that's a big part of what I've been seeking to try and do over what now has been 20 years. Time flies.
Well, I am a little bit concerned, having listened to some of the rhetoric coming out of both sides of politics, that perhaps our political leaders are not as historically literate as their former heroes and our previous politicians. Would you say that's a fair assumption, that perhaps they are not educated in the history of politics and so are not recognising the danger of rising Marxism?
Absolutely. And, I should have, in response to your earlier question, I do think that there is an element of the conservative side of politics, A, that is illiterate of history, but B, that is perhaps complicit with cultural Marxism. Whether they know it as that philosophy by name, they're complicit in just going with the flow. But you've only got to read, the speeches of the founder of the Liberal Party, Sir Robert Menzies, to realise that he understood where the battle lines were drawn in his day. In the post-war years, clearly there was an ideological struggle going on between Soviet communism and its empire of expansion and the Free West. And of course, that was fought out over the Cold War and some hot wars like the Vietnam War. But the basic ideas there are still with us in the intelligentsia, as they were with the intelligentsia in Menzies' days. And again, you just got to read some of his speeches to see him castigating the elites of the 50s and 60s, even some in the church, who Menzies called out as being complicit with communist ideology. Well, today, the Marxists have worked out that people don't much like gulags and guns, but they are now using anti-discrimination legislation, which has been weaponized against wrong think and cancel culture to enforce the same ideas. And in some ways, that's even more sinister. Although I'm glad the gulags and the guns aren't part of it, but I think it's only a matter of time before more and more coercion comes and constrains us all as these woke cultural Marxist ideas gain more and more currency, particularly with the younger generation.
Yes, well, Menzies is one of the most misquoted politicians of our time, used by the left and the wet liberals in order to prop up their broad church politics, when that is, of course, not at all what Menzies meant when in his holistic writings. And you have to read the whole of his work to understand what he was getting at. But my point is, what do you think is going to happen to conservative politics in Australia if its leaders continue to kowtow to the fringe left of politics?
I think conservative politics is in danger of being overwhelmed by the left, and I would include in the left some in the libertarian right who unwittingly go, are probably the useful idiots for cultural Marxism, but because of the lack of engagement in the battle of ideas from most politicians in the Liberals and National Party, we are being swept along, and we live in an advocacy system where ideas have to be spoken about, they have to be fought for, truth has to be fought for, but too often politicians on the centre-right fear what the media think, fear what the ABC think, fear what the elites think, and don't want to have the fight. And in my observing of politics over 20 years and having worked for a short period as a staffer in the federal parliament with the National Party, and then as a lobbyist there for 10 years, I would watch the Greens get up every morning, move notices of motion in the Senate. These are meaningless things. It's all symbolic, but it gave them the chance to advocate for their crazy ideas. Fast forward, 15 or so years, and many of these ideas are now part of mainstream public policy with the centre-right having capitulated. Such as the attack on the coal industry, for instance. I remember Bob Brown calling for the end of coal, 20 years ago, and just thinking that's crazy. Well, now you've got the Liberal Party in New South Wales saying they're going to shut down all the coal-fired power stations and that they won't even replace them with gas-fired power because that's a fossil fuel. So you can see how far this has moved. That's just one area of policy by way of example, where our people haven't engaged the battle of ideas and have been overwhelmed. And so I think the future is very bleak for conservative centre-right politics unless a bit more spine is found. It's no good for our Prime Minister, as much as I really respect him, to try and pass these off as unimportant. They are very important, and they are affecting jobs, they're affecting freedoms, and they're affecting the culture of this country, and it's being transformed before our eyes, and it's being lost almost without a fight from the centre-right.
I also suspected it will lead to their loss at the subsequent elections if they don't manage to find their spiritual centre. But let's move to your wonderful announcement that happened just recently, in which you will be taking over from Fred Niles when he retires in November. This will leave you to take over the Christian Democratic Party. Are you nervous about filling the shoes of the longest serving member of the New South Wales Parliament, or you are just excited and eager to get going?
It's a mixture of both, Ellie. I'm obviously very excited. This is an opportunity that came out of the blue. I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't on my radar. They approached me just a few weeks ago, and it just seemed like a really good fit once we started talking about it and worked through the process. But yes, I am nervous as well. It's very daunting. Politics is not for the faint-hearted, and particularly someone who approaches politics as a Christian. And as a conservative, it is a hostile environment. There's no doubt about that. Mark Latham is also in the New South Wales Upper House as a conservative, as a great friend of Christians by his own work and admission. And the sort of vitriol he cops is quite enormous. And so I'm expecting it's not going to be easy. But I'm certainly looking forward to the challenge, and looking forward to the platform that Parliament gives. Again, to elevate our issues. And my real hope with the position when Fred does step down in November is that'll give me an opportunity in the lead up to the 2023 election to really elevate some of the issues that I'm passionate about, that are really important to the Christian community, but also of value to the wider public. And I'm really hoping that these ideas will cut through, and that we'll get support for that, and it will give people hope that more voices are rising up to combat the hard left, which seems to have the megaphone at the moment.
Yes, well, if you want to, politics for conservatives, it's certainly not a safe space. And if you want to see what's difficult, try being a woman. We get death threats every single week from the left. They are absolutely incessant. But if you could achieve one thing in your first year of politics, what would that be? What do you really want to get done straight away?
Look, it's very hard to prioritise. Look, probably one of the key things is to just see this insidious gender fluid ideology that's being inflicted upon our children, to see that pushed back. I'd love to see that if I could achieve something in a first year, to see that come to the public's consciousness in such a way that politicians will act to root it out of the curriculum. And Mark Latham, who's been in the New South Wales Upper House for a few years now, he's done some terrific work on this. I've been campaigning on this for more than 5 years, going back to my time at ACL. In fact, we were one of the first groups in Australia to raise this issue in the public's consciousness in the lead up to the same-sex marriage plebiscite. And it has shocked me just how this issue has metastasised, how the hard left have been able to infiltrate this into pretty much every school curriculum in Australia, right down to early childhood education, teaching children that gender has nothing to do with your biology. It's something that is in your mind, how you feel, and therefore you should alter your body accordingly, sometimes irreversibly. And I think this is incredibly damaging and harmful to children. So that's something I'd love to see really dealt with. If that's something I could achieve in the first year, that would be awesome. Obviously building on good work that's been done before I arrive in the place.
Well, let's talk about that. There is a fundamental difference between tolerance of ideas and lifestyles that differ from social norms, and state-funded affirmation, in which individuals are punished if they refuse to agree with different moral practices. And the school system, as you correctly stated, has become a flashpoint for this discussion due to teachers and politicians using the education system as a tool of political activism instead of a place of learning. I would argue that things like Mark Latham's Parental Rights Bill is not about banning gender fluidity from school. It's asking what on earth these topics are doing in the curriculum in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's true. As I look at Mark's bill, I think he is calling for a ban on teaching children that their gender is fluid.
I meant that humorously. I meant that humorously. The idea that there even has to be a bill about this seems to be completely absurd. It shouldn't even have to be stated.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're exactly right. It is just ridiculous that we're even having this discussion. But this goes to the issue we were talking about before. People don't even realise there's a culture war, but of course there is. When you've got activists through the education department and through teachers' unions, insisting that children be taught this pseudo. It's not even science. It's like a religion. It's some sort of transcendentalism that divorces you from your biological reality. And the fact that Mark Latham has to put forward a bill that says we should ban the teaching of gender fluid ideology to children, and then also saying that parents should have the right to withdraw their children from any classes that they think might be of an ideological nature that they're not comfortable with, that they feel are values that they want to teach in the home rather than school. That's all perfectly reasonable. But yesterday in the Parliament, or I'm not sure when this is going to broadcast, sorry, Ellie, if I've mucked up your timelines, but there were public hearings very recently, and trans activists got up and yelled at Mark Latham, interrupted the hearings, yelled at him, called him a bigot, and had to be escorted out by police. Now, this is just the intolerance. These people can't argue their case rationally. They have to yell and scream and call people names. And to uphold their right to have children indoctrinated in something which leads them along a path to chemical castration, surgical castration, and bodily mutilation, particularly for young girls. This fight is about whether that sort of encouragement to minors can continue to be pushed through our public schools. And I think the overwhelming majority of parents would not want that at all.
Well, just for our viewers who might not have read the bill themselves, I just have a short paragraph here to read to clarify what the bill actually stands for. Now, this is the opening paragraph of Mark Latham's Parental Rights Bill. It says, to clarify that parents and not schools are primarily responsible for the development and formation of their children in relation to core values such as ethical and moral standards, social and political values, and an understanding of personal identity, including in relation to gender and sexuality. Now, it goes on to demand that schools adopt transparency in what they are teaching their children and giving parents the opportunity to withdraw their children from non-essential courses that promote social ideology. So how is this an act of harm or oppression as claimed by the activists? It seems more to me like this is restoring the previous system, which worked really well.
Exactly right. The answer to your question lies in a comment that the activist April Holcomb said, a quote that he or she, I'm not sure what gender, and I'm not trying to be smart or disrespectful to the individual, but this is the person who yelled out in the inquiry and interrupted it, said that they were concerned that Mark Latham's bill assumed that children were the property of their parents and did not have individual rights. Now, that's the way that April Holcomb phrased it. But the reality is parents do have responsibility for their children. And what these activists are saying is they don't believe in the rights of parents at all to guide their children, particularly when it comes to issues about chemical castration through puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then surgical castration, and then mutilation. Many young girls, since this gender fluid epidemic caught on through social contagion, have had their breasts removed. But what April Holcomb is saying is that parents have no rights to guide their children in these matters. Now, this is outrageous, and this is where the battle for ideas is the hottest, and that's why you have activists yelling in Parliament trying to shut down an inquiry that's rationally looking at this, because the philosophical ideas are completely antithetical. You've got Mark Latham on one hand speaking on behalf of the majority of parents, saying parents should have the right to guide their children and have control over what they're taught. And that's consistent with international conventions from the UN. But these activists don't believe in that. They believe that even minors are autonomous beings that should have separate rights quite apart from any wishes of their parents. Now, that's a very radical concept, and one which I think most parents, it completely disempowers parents and makes them irrelevant in terms of the raising their children. Of course, that's not the will of most parents. They have the right to guide their parents at least to adulthood, when the children can make up their own minds and make up their own decisions, but not under this brave new world that the radical left are promoting.
Well, it's not even a new idea. The concept that children are property of the state and not the parents is basically par for the core in Marxism, where the state wants to take over the complete education and socialization of kids so that they worship the state and don't form familiar bonds and overthrow the eventual dictatorship. That's how it works. It's basically rehashing last century's problematic political discord. But activist groups are complaining in this case that the bill prohibits schools from referring students to what they call gender affirming support. But that's the point, isn't it? That's what parents want. They want teachers and the education system to stop interfering with the private and sexual lives of their children, because it's not appropriate, for one, and it's not their place. So their criticism of the bill seems to be what the general population actually desires the bill to achieve in the first place.
Absolutely. And the parent should have the say over what help is sought for a child that might be experiencing confusion over their gender. Some parents might choose to go down an affirming path. Some might choose to go down the watch and wait path, which was the clinical practice prior to gender fluid ideology catching on in the culture in the last 5 or 10 years. But
it's very different, isn't it? The difference between schools had counselling sessions for kids who were struggling. Well, that's fine. That's all well and good if kids have a gap in their lives and they require a bit of additional help. But this is mutated into the school becoming the social support network for the child. And I think that's where they have overstepped the mark.
That they have, and they incorrectly say that Latham's bill means that a child who, in their words, is trans, or who I would say is struggling with their gender identity, with their biological reality, that they can't be helped or supported. I mean, that's absolute rubbish, and that's I'm absolutely sure that's not the intent of Mark Latham's bill, and it's not my intent in my critique of gender fluid ideology. Any student that is struggling or that has an issue deserves love and compassion and all the support in the world. But that's a long way from then teaching the rest of the class an objective, fact in their minds that gender is on a spectrum and is fluid, and that I believe is a very harmful ideology. And so there's a lot of misrepresentation of Latham's intent, and it's quite pernicious. These people are not honest in the way they characterise the bill. They try and make it sound like Latham's bill says that so-called trans kids don't exist. Well, no one's going to say that there might not be the occasional child struggling with their gender identity. It's not about that, but it is about ensuring that parents are in the best position to help their child, and that the school is not indoctrinating the rest of the class in a dangerous and harmful ideology that can lead to irreversible consequences.
Yes, it will also be a consideration that perhaps it's the activists themselves who are causing the most harm to the children who genuinely do have gender dysphoria, finding their very personal and private struggle with their gender suddenly the centre of social commentary and politics in the country. I mean, that's a lot of pressure for kids who are trying to grapple with their own ideas and their own personal understanding, to find themselves pawns in a political game that's much larger than them.
Yeah, that's the tragedy of all this. I mean, gender dysphoria has always been with us. It's been extremely rare. And if you talk to teachers who have taught for decades, they'll say they've hardly even seen it or never seen it. It's very rare. The last 5 or 10 years, it's developed into an epidemic. I think it's more contagious than, it's a bit like the coronavirus in one sense in terms of its spread, but far more harm. It will harm more young people than the coronavirus ever will. And you've only got to look at the growing detransitioner movement of people who have taken action on their body and realised they've made a terrible mistake. Kira Bell is a high-profile case in the UK. It's very, very tragic, and I think this is a fad. It's an ideology that's being spread by political activists, and I do think too many children, sadly, are becoming pawns in this, and they are being caught up in a game of identity politics. And of course, when you're young and you're still forming your political values, your philosophies, you're very ripe for this sort of manipulation, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Well, just to finish off with the education system, I'll make one final point. Even since I was at school, the amount of money that we have been funneling into the education system appears to have made it worse. Our education statistics have been plummeting on a global scale, and we're now at the point where teachers and politicians have decided that it's almost too stressful to test kids. But I suspect that's because they don't want to find out how badly children are doing and reflect poorly on teachers. Do you think that perhaps we are giving too much money to education and that's all that's doing is funding activism instead of facilitating old-fashioned learning, which is sadly lacking in our education system?
Yes, I totally agree with your analysis. I think the rigour has gone out of it. I do think, and this is a broader discussion, that there's some kids that the education system is not well suited to that are better to get to go on a vocational path. We made a big mistake in the 1980s when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister and said everyone had to go to year 12. That was a big mistake. We should always be looking for the pathway for children who are more vocationally orientated to direct them that way, and others on an academic path as to ability. And those that do go on the academic path do need to be able to read textbooks, withstand the pressure of exams. This sort of rigour is not bad. But at the moment, it's almost like education is every child gets a prize, and there seems to be very little rigour in it. I've noticed that with my own kids' education.
Let me clarify my point there for a second. I understand your vocational training, but I'm talking about the academic kids who are leaving school and getting 2 degrees, and they can't even file things in alphabetical order. So it's not that we've got some kids who aren't suited to education. The basic system of education, which they say their top students are leaving at a lower standard than they should be.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you there. Sorry, I took you off on a little tangent there, but I'm certainly agreeing with the substantive point. It worries me enormously. You talked earlier about the lack of knowledge of history by politicians. This next generation has complete historical amnesia, and if you don't know where you've come from, you won't know where you're going. And sadly, that's where we are at this point in time, and we desperately need to recover our history and our sense of self-worth as a culture which has been badly beaten by decades of cultural Marxism that tells us we're no good. You combine that with a terrible education, and you've lost all ability to fight for your culture and to know where you stand. And so we're in a very precarious position at this point in history, where I think we could go either way, and it'll depend on the good work of people like yourself and other culture warriors. Hopefully I can play a part. I think the voices that are rising up now are the hope to try and help our society realise its error and see if we can pull things back from the brink.
Yeah, that's why I was so sad to lose all my books, because you have to teach yourself these days. My education was pointless as far as history and politics goes. But now that friendly part of the interview is over, I'm going to ask you some more challenging questions, because I'm allowed to. Religion and politics. Now, this is where you and I differ a little bit in the conservative spectrum, because obviously I'm a secular humanist and you are a Christian. So straight up difference there. And that's quite common in Australia for conservative politics to be divided this way, unlike America. So like a statistically significant portion of Australians, I like to keep my religion out of politics and vice versa. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to keep religious people out of politics. It just means that I don't indulge in quoting of scriptural gods in relation to policy or political discussions. Now, I also think it might be one of the reasons that the Australian Conservative Party didn't do as well as it should have, because it was closely linked to religion rather than conservative politics in general. And we also had the problem where, of course, Europe had a difficult relationship with politics and religion. At the end of the day, they decided to separate each other for the protection of both, and it worked out quite well, and Australia inherited that separation. Now, my question is, do you find that the open declaration of religion in your new party's name might hold it back from its voting potential? Not that that's a bad thing. I mean, there's a position for minor parties to be continuously in the debate to hold the major parties to accord. It's just, do you think it will have an impact on the growth of your party?
Yes, I think it will, and I think it does. Now, it is a minor party that does have a particular niche in the upper house of New South Wales, and over 40 years, the Christian Democratic Party has held 2 seats for most of that period. They did lose 1 seat at the last New South Wales election in 2019. So there has been a downward trend. My hope is that I can increase the vote, and that's an open question. That'll depend on how we go over the next 18 months or so. But yes, it is a niche party. But my hope would be, Ellie, that I can show that that despite the fact that we are, unashamedly Christian and we're branded that way, that our policies are for the common good. And now that people will have to make that judgment when they see more of how the party operates, with myself involved and having more of a profile. But I think there will be some attraction to people who are not necessarily Christian people or religious, but who like the values and can see that the values are good for our society. I agree with you. I think church and state should be separate. That is something which Christian people actually helped introduce because of problems that had occurred in Europe. But it's never meant to be the case that it should disbar people of any faith from having a say in politics and participating fully as citizens in politics. It just means that the church doesn't run the state, and it also means that the state doesn't run the church. But more latterly, separation of church and state has been used mischievously by secular leftists. I'm not saying yourself, but certainly most on the left, to try and suggest that Christians shouldn't be able to bring their points of view into the public square. And I'll just make one final point on this tangent, is that everyone brings a value system to politics, whether you're a secular humanist, as you are. There is a philosophical framework that you see the world in. You bring those values into politics. I see the world through a Christian framework, and I see the ideas of the Bible and the Christian faith as having relevance to public policy. It doesn't mean I can mandate my religion. That's not my aim. But it means that I can argue for public policy that comes from an ethical framework informed by the Bible and informed by our Western Christian tradition.
Yes, I think that's why I clarified saying I don't think that it should prevent anybody of religion from entering politics. I think what most people are envisioning with religion and politics is that they don't want one person's God dictating the will of other people who may not follow it. That's more the general idea of religion and politics, rather than a more spiritual framework, which I think is what your party inspires its politics by, and its values, which is, of course, how everyone sees their politics.
Sadly, though, the left, that they will accuse people like me of trying to impose my morals, my religion on them. Say on an issue like the definition of marriage in public policy, I think marriage should be defined as monogamous relationship between two people of the opposite sex. That's a public policy position, but they think it should be defined in a different way. But if I bring the definition that I think is best for human flourishing into the public square, I'm accused of imposing my religion on them. And yet, if they bring their definition, well, that's fine. Well, I just think that's intellectually dishonest. They're coming from a particular framework. It's a philosophical framework. For some, it may not be religion, but it's nonetheless a framework. But I just don't think it's fair to say just because you have a religious point of view, your ideas about public policy are invalid. And often religion is used as a trump card to try and silence us. The Greens, many in the Greens have a quasi-religious framework. Bob Brown openly talks about Gaia. It's a form of pantheism. It's a religion. He brings that into, or when he was in the Parliament, he brought that into his approach to public policy. No one said, Bob, you've got to leave Gaia at the door of the Senate when you go in. He was fully accepted. Yet Christians come under, I think, unfair scrutiny because of their religious framework, and there's a double standard there.
Well, let's talk about why that is in a second. A disagreement about whether religion belongs in politics is, of course, not the same as an open hatred of religion, which is what we see from particularly the Marxist left. Now, they do not hate all religion. They often include things like Islam in their portfolios if they think it can help them win some migrant-heavy seats. And so, even though, of course, Islam is completely at odds to their liberal social order. But beside the point, what we see from the left is a hatred specifically of Christian religions. Now, this is left over from its Marxist roots in the last 2 centuries, in which Christianity was closely tied to the monarchy, and therefore it is socialism's eternal enemy. And not only is it the eternal enemy of socialism, we also see that a religion like Christianity competes for affection with the Marxist worship of the state. So do you think activists today, especially young activists, have any idea why they are taught to hate Christianity? Or do you think they just copy what their lecturers tell them, that Christianity is bad, and they've got no idea the historical reasons behind Marxism's hatred of Christianity?
Yeah, I think you've summed it up really well. And you know, we do forget that there is a competition for the affections of humans, and the reason Marxism hates Christianity is because it says that there is a God to which all humans are accountable, and it's not the state. And they like to think that the state or that man, you know, humankind, is the highest authority, whereas people of Christian faith and Muslims would say there is a higher, there's a transcendent being, i.e. God, to which we are accountable. Now, as Christians, we would say, well, that actually is an almighty safeguard, because when humans think they are God and they're the highest authority, that's when we often see terrible abuses. Now, I'm not trying to whitewash the fact there's been some terrible abuses in the name of the church and Christianity down through history. There has. But when Christianity operates the way that Jesus of Nazareth intended it, it is expressed in society with a humility that acknowledges that humans don't have all the wisdom, and that there's something above us and someone to whom we are accountable, that therefore checks our behaviour, and particularly our behaviour to our fellow humans. And Marxism wants to do away, hates the idea of God, hates the idea of accountability to the transcendent, and vies for our loyalty and affection, as you say. And I think so many young people, again, because they no longer understand religion, they're not taught it anymore. You know, a generation ago, at least most people had been to Sunday school or had some form of religious education.
I got kicked out of Sunday school, just to be clear. I went one day and I didn't even make it half an hour. My mum had to come pick me up. She was like, typical.
Sure, you were very naughty, Ellie. You're probably asking too many hard questions.
That's exactly what I did. I asked too many questions.
Well, that's a shame, because that should be encouraged. But yeah, this is the problem. So people, they don't have any religious formation, and so again, they're being used as pawns for the state, which wants them to be under its control and its loyalty. And you know, I think the power grab that we've seen by politicians during the pandemic is should be ringing big alarm bells, because this is how statism and scientism operates, where man is the final authority, and we all just go along worshipping the state and bowing to its wishes for the way our lives should be controlled.
Oh, well, this isn't even one of my questions, but when we talk about the state and collectivism, it amazes me how few university graduates who claim to love collectivism and Marxism have no idea the funding principles of it, and therefore have never read arguments like the Karl Popper argument against why communism fails, and so have no idea the structures of which they're standing on and how dangerous the ideas they're demanding society adopt. But that's not even a question. The hatred of Christians brings us to the treatment of Scott Morrison and his wife, Jenny Morrison. Now, it barely a week goes past in which you don't see a trending hashtag on Twitter that is attacking Morrison's faith or the churches that may be associated with him. And it interests me because you never see the left talk about the fact that the Catholic faith is very much a part of the Labor Party and has been forever and is still a part of the Labor Party, because I think that would intersect awkwardly with their other campaign against certain churches and things. Yeah. So given the obvious hypocrisy in the way religion is treated by the online activists, how much of this hatred of Christianity do you think is just a mechanism to try and get rid of people holding political party on the opposite power on the opposite side to politics?
I think it's definitely that. I think it's the hard left trying to send a message to Christians that you're not welcome here, to try and scare them away from being part of the political space. And look, you look at the way Jenny Morrison has been treated by Magda Szubanski most recently, just held up as an object of ridicule, insulting. You know, here she is photographed next to her husband signing a condolence book for Prince Philip. And Jenny Morrison is quite rightly, dressed in black. Nothing unusual about that. And somehow Magna makes some link to The Handmaid's Tale, as if Jenny is, somehow being oppressed by Scott Morrison by the fact that she's dressed like that while they're signing condolence. I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's not even funny. But what it does, it serves to show just how pernicious the left is, and just how irrational their hatred is of Christians. And in this case, Magna was trying to make a statement about a Christian man, i.e. Scott Morrison, and somehow suggest that he oppresses his wife by the fact that she was standing next to him dressed like that. I mean, it's so outrageous, but I think it's got to be called out because this is dangerous stuff. Because if these ideas catch on, Magna's got a massive following. It's really stigmatizing a section of the population. Now, we've seen what that does down through history, and it doesn't work.
Well, look, I read a lot of the comments from Magda under her thread, the people who were agreeing with her. And it might interest you to know that probably about half of them, when you read through them, are actually being made by Christians. So these are Christians who are attacking Morrison and Jenny for being basically other Christians. And this is why I'm starting to suspect that the activists are trying to overplay the role of religion in Scott Morrison and Jenny Morrison in order to try and paint them as these overt religious figures, which they presume Australians will not want to vote for, because of what I mentioned before, and using that as a way to take them out of power because they have nothing else to work with on that front.
Yeah, look, I think that's right, and that's what makes it so scary.
Magda, I think we could both agree that Magda definitely bit off more than she could chew when she made that comment about Jenny Morrison, because she copped a lot more flack than she did support. And one thing that annoys me about conservatives is when they fight back and when they put it back on the left about how terrible their comments are, the left have to walk it back, and they often do. And it makes me wonder why conservative politicians don't do that more often and don't come out and say, hang on a second, that is wrong, and lay into the left like they should. I mean, what are they afraid of?
That's right, and they should. Look, I haven't seen much contrition on the part of Magna. I saw the highlights of her interview with Tracy Grimshaw on Channel 9, The Current Affair, but it seemed like Magna was doubling down. She was unrepentant. But your point is right. The old adage is the best way to stand up to a bully is to stand up to the bullies. And too often the left are bullying conservatives. They're bullying people of Christian faith. Now, I believe in operating in the meekness of Christ, but that doesn't mean you're a pushover either. And I think there is a place for firmly but graciously stating your case and calling out untruths and calling out these sort of examples where that they've overstretched the mark, because Magna was way off the mark. I think the thing that Magna hates, and this goes back to Marxism, she hates the idea of heterosexual marriage. The Morrisons, say what you like about them, they obviously have a wonderful, affectionate, mutually respectful marriage. And they have both chosen different roles within that relationship. That's their choice. Jenny obviously has played a more nurturing role with their girls. Scott, of course, has pursued a political career, and she has obviously supported in that. I think feminists like Magna deep down hate that idea and hate the fact that that's a role model that's presented to the nation by virtue of the fact of the people who are occupying that office at this time. I suspect that is part of the animus that we see through this latest episode of outpouring of hatred towards Scott and Jenny Morrison.
Oh, don't worry, Lyle. I'll bring the pitchforks because I have no such problem with that. And I'm a farm girl, so I've got plenty of bite to take to the left. Now, we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to mention Greta Thunberg is back. She has returned to her little spotlight of eco-fascism. And my question is, now that she's no longer operating under the protection of being basically a child star of the left, she's now basically an adult, has to operate in the adult sphere and be open to criticism. Do you think that she's going to remain a political activist on the left, or will they ditch her and find another, 4-year-old to promote their climate communism that they've got going on?
Look, I'm sure they'll be on the lookout for the next 4-year-old or 16-year-old. But meanwhile, Greta has been thrust again into the spotlight as a poster child or poster adult. She's 18 now, doing a press conference with the World Health Organization and essentially running the Chinese Communist Party line that the virus somehow, jumped from nature to humans. And then Greta's there linking it to, tree clearing and deforestation and saying, well, the climate crisis is now linked to the virus crisis. And because we've done such a great job through totalitarian means of suppressing the virus, or at least trying to in some countries, that this is the approach we should take with climate change. So I think it's very dangerous. We talked earlier about religion and politics. This is the new secular religion, and secular is not the right word for it. It is a complete,
No, let's be really clear. Marxism and collectivism is actually a political religion because it operates inside the moral and ethical centres that are usually reserved for religion rather than politics. So some politics are actually religions as well as politics.
Yeah, and this is what Greta is bringing into the public discourse with her latest intervention. But I think it's frightening because not only is it religious, it's obviously highly political, but it's playing into the hands of the regime that is an existential threat to Australia, and that is the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's very, I was going to say naive of the World Health Organization. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They covered up for the CCP right from the get-go when the virus came out of Wuhan, probably out of a lab there, possibly as part of a weapons program. But that's speculation, but there's a lot of intelligence to suggest that. And here's Greta running the lines of the CCP, again in cahoots with the World Health Organization, which is supposed to be a neutral United Nations body. This is quite sinister stuff. And again, I think it's got to be called out. And this is why I'm very disappointed in the federal government since the Biden presidency that we've now moved further and further in the direction of the UN and the Paris Agreement. Well, we're already in the Paris Agreement, but heading towards net zero. We are embracing this new religion, lock, stock and barrel. And we've aligned ourselves with Greta and the UN, and I think it's deeply disturbing because the only regime it benefits is the CCP. They get strong using our coal. We get weak by not using our coal.
Well, let's not forget that the WHO is hardly an impartial organisation, considering that the CCP funded Ted Ross's political party, and so he kind of owes them a bit of a favour when it comes to that. But we're basically out of time, Lyle, so I'm going to ask you our final fun question that we always do on Curtain Call, which is, if you could have dinner with anybody living or dead, who would it be and why?
I would love to have dinner with William Wilberforce. He was a 18th and 19th century British parliamentarian who fought for the abolition of the slave trade. He was a man of deep Christian faith. He brought religion into politics, and as a result of bringing religion into politics, he brought in the idea that the black person is our brother and should be treated as such. And with that philosophical basis, informed by his religion, was successful eventually in seeing the British Parliament abolish the slave trade. And that led to the Royal Navy patrolling the world's oceans right up until the First World War, looking for slave trading ships. And it banished the idea, at least in our consciousnesses, of slavery. And so I'd love to have dinner with William Wilberforce. I've been to Clapham Common where he lived and seen some of the houses where he and his compatriots were. And I would have loved to have gone to the Clapham mansions and had dinner with him and his friends as they discussed how they could abolish the slave trade over several decades.
Well, that is a wonderful answer, Lyle. And thank you so much for joining us this week on Curtain Call.
Thanks so much, Ellie.
Thank you for joining us on Curtain Call. We are hosted by The Good Source, the home of conservative and libertarian voices. Help us by following us online. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and all good podcasting services. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe.